video, we're going to talk about a few different types of non-legal research sources. So why are we talking about non-legal resources in a class called Massachusetts Legal Research? So there have been a couple of studies that have looked into the different types of resources new associates use, and it turns out that attorneys don't just look for statutes and cases. They also do more general research, looking for things like public records. So this is going to be a really broad overview on this topic. For each resource, we're going to look at a few sources, and I'm going to give you a few tips, but it's going to be more of a bird's eye view. We just don't have time to go into a lot of detail on each of these things that we're talking about in this category of information. Let's talk about this in a little more detail. So what are the kinds of information you might be asked to look for? So you might need to find information about your own client or other parties or people who are witnesses in your case, so kind of information about people. You might find out information about a judge you're appearing before. For example, how often does that particular judge rule in favor of the plaintiff versus the defendant? You might need to find information about companies for a transaction that you're working on, as well as for litigation matters. For example, you might want to know what the subsidiaries of the company are. For litigation, you might be asked to find statistics to help bolster an argument that you're making in your case. So I've gone over a couple of examples, but why else? Let's give a few more. So you might need to research a foreign company's registered agent so that you could serve process in a litigation matter. For public company documents, you might be trying to find a material contract that's been required to be filed because of the SEC rules. You might be looking for past cases of opposing counsel to find out how they've argued something in the past or what clients they've represented. You could be looking for prior testimony of an expert witness that you're thinking about hiring. Again, these are just a few examples of the types of research that you might be asked to conduct. That's sort of non-legal, or at least I would call it maybe just quasi-legal. So let's talk a little bit about the sources. So for lawyers, judges, and expert witnesses, there are these things called directories. They used to be in print, probably some of them still are, but we can find a lot of them online now. A lot of these were mentioned in the reading. On Lexis, there is a category called directories that we're going to take a quick look at, and the same on Westlaw. There are a few other categories separate from the directories that I wanted to mention. On Lexis, there's a tool called Litigation Profile Suite. On Bloomberg Law, you can do a people search that includes prominent people, including some prominent lawyers and judges. On Westlaw, there's a tool called the Profiler that we can use to find this kind of information. In Massachusetts, we have a tool called the Massachusetts Lawyer's Diary and Manual. It's actually a red book, and it has some brief information about Massachusetts judges and some information about courthouses, as well as actually including a paper diary, although I don't think people use that part anymore. Also, these days, court websites, of course, are a good place to find out, to go to get some information, basic information about judges. So we're not going to have time to talk about public records law in Massachusetts in too much detail, but I wanted to make you aware of some of the basics. So I gave you an assignment to read the overview of the guide to Massachusetts public records law. So this is a really long PDF, but I'm only asking you to read the overview. A lot of things that you might need for a case might not be available online at an agency, so you might have to request those public records from a Massachusetts agency. So this is the Massachusetts equivalent to FOIA if you've studied that in any of your classes. So what are the sources of public records that we're going to take a look at? So for people, there are a couple of good things accessible on Lexis and Westlaw. On Lexis, we do have access to the public records database, but we have to be careful to only use it for a permissible use. So for you guys, that means only if it's something that a professor has asked you for, maybe that has to do with a clinic, or a supervisor has asked you for at work. So I'm going to show you a quick screenshot of the public records that are accessible on Lexis so that you can get an idea of the categories of information. But it's not something you should be using without that kind of direction from a professor or a supervisor. On Westlaw, they have public records materials, but we don't even have access to them on our academic passwords. So I'll just show you a quick screenshot of the types of information that are available on that database. So generally, the types of information are things like marriage record, criminal records, asset reports. Sometimes there'll be credit information available, those types of things. The other source we'll take a quick look at is the Massachusetts Public Records Division. And there are a lot of other sources of information that we're not going to be able to cover, but I have also listed here a good free web guide that lists lots of these other sources, including some that contain information about people, which is kind of what we're talking about in this category. All right, so I promised you a couple screenshots. This one's on Westlaw. It just shows you the type of information that you could find about a person on Westlaw using this database if you have it at work. You can see there are things like arrest records, like I mentioned, bankruptcy records, assets, that type of thing. This is the screenshot for Lexis Advanced Public Records. Again, this is something you do have access to, but I'm saying don't use it unless you have a permissible use. You can see it's outlined at the bottom. It says that. So what it's doing is it's aggregating, it's pulling information from lots of different public filings. And again, you can see there's criminal records, real property records, death records, voter registration, that type of thing. All right, so let's talk about public records for companies. So it's going to be easiest to find records for publicly listed companies. So those are the companies that must comply with the SEC reporting requirements, and because of that, they file lots of information. For example, they must file their formation documents, their charter and bylaws. They must file material agreements that they have with other companies, lists of subsidiaries, those types of things. All right. Let's talk a little bit about the sources. On Bloomberg Law, there's a source called, I think it's now actually called Company Lookup in the new Business Intelligence Center. We'll take a quick look at that. Lexis has a database called Company Profiles that has some similar information, reports with financial information, executive officers, that type of thing. On Westlaw, there is some company information in the Business Law Center. And of course, nowadays, company websites are a great place to get company information. One source we can use to find information about companies that are registered to do business in Massachusetts is the Secretary of the Commonwealth's website, where we can look up things like the formation, documents, and registered agent with addresses. Some other sources that can be a good way to find information about company, dockets, which we've already covered, EDGAR filings, so those are those SEC filings, are also going to be a good place to find information about public companies. So I wanted to cover a few sources where you can find those EDGAR SEC filings for public companies. On Westlaw, it's going to be in the Business Law Center. On Lexis, the database is called SEC Filings, and on Bloomberg, it's EDGAR Filings. And then there's a free government website that you can use to find these filings at the SEC, and I've given you the link here. It's called Free EDGAR. So these resources are not specific to Massachusetts, but of course you can use them to look up information about public Massachusetts companies. One research tip I have for you is that a good place to find a lot of information about a public company is to use the 10-K or annual report. This is because due to the SEC rules, public companies are required to file a lot of information in this document. Again, this is a broad overview of a much larger topic, just to give you a few basics of where you could go to find information about publicly listed companies. This is a reminder that when you're looking at a docket, that it can be a good place to find information that was filed in a particular case. For example, if it was a case that had to do with some kind of employment law issue, you might find employment contracts that are part of the filings. You might find employee manuals or other agreements that might have been filed due to the nature of the case. I wanted to talk briefly about finding statistics, which was also covered in the reading. We won't look at all of these, but we will look at the first one, which is actually a list of websites for statistics, a quite good list. Other things you might be asked to look for are court statistics. So the Bureau of Justice Statistics includes things like the number of people that are incarcerated by gender or race, so that's also a good source. For Massachusetts specific information, it varies a lot depending on the department. So you're going to want to check the agency website to see what is available. So I've given you an example here, the Department of Public Health, which does have some helpful statistics. The final thing I gave you is Mass Facts, which is a web guide put together by the Boston Globe. This is another list of helpful databases and sources that are specific to Massachusetts. Okay, so that was our general overview of doing non-legal research.